Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, so we're going to start off with me doing a bit of a mea culpa. Over on Bluesky, I had suggested that when it comes to these by-elections that are going to be happening in Toronto, that Mark Carney was going to, per his pattern so far, slot some of his banker friends into those safe ridings so that they can get easy passage to the House of Commons, and he did not. He has appointed a head of family medicine at University of Toronto to run in University of Rosedale, and amazingly, the deputy leader of the provincial NDP to run in Scarborough seat, which Bill Blair just vacated. And that's both interesting choices, but it led to this conversation online about open nominations and whether or not this was a legitimate use of the leader's power. Essentially being told by certain people that this is always the way it's been done and I shouldn't complain. But that's not true. Open nominations are, particularly for much of Canadian history, been the way in which parties get to choose the representatives in their riding. And by parties, in this case, I'm meaning the grassroots members of those parties, meaning people who go out and buy memberships for the party in the riding get to choose who's going to represent them. And from then on, those are the people whose names get put on the ballot before the election. And this was commonplace, and there have been ebbs and flows over the course of the decades as to how seriously parties take this. A good historical example, there's an NFB film, it's about 15 minutes long, called The Right Candidate for Rosedale. It's about how Ann Cools, before she was a senator, went to run for a seat in Rosedale and challenged the establishment status quo, and went out and signed up a lot of the people who the party was ignoring, meaning poor and marginalized people in that riding, to run or to get memberships so that they could support her nomination bid. And this turned into a giant race. In the end, thousands of people wound up signing up as members. The nomination meeting kept having to be held at bigger and bigger venues because it spiraled out so much. In the end, Ann Cools did not win that nomination, but it certainly re-energized nomination contests for a generation. She was eventually appointed to the Senate by Pierre Trudeau. But it shook up the establishment, the status quo, and these are the kinds of things that nomination races should be doing. Now, the NDP likes to claim that all of their nominations are open. That is mostly true, but they like to find exceptions for people who they think can win the riding if it's close, and oftentimes those tend to be straight white men. And there's been countless examples of that where they will have suspended their open nomination rules for it. And the Conservatives have largely had fairly open nominations for a lot of their ridings, and in particular, because in certain parts of the country where there are a lot of safe Conservative seats, it's those nomination races that get really heated because that determines who's going to be the candidate in a fairly safe riding. And, right to the point where there are reports of fistfights in parking lots and so on, because these nomination meetings get so heated. So again, open nominations are a fairly established part of federal politics in Canada. And it was 2015 where every party had pledged that they were going to be open nominations, and that was how every party ran them that particular election cycle. And then we got into this whole thing about protecting nominations for incumbents, because they're so busy in Ottawa that they can't fend off a challenge in their riding, which is kind of bogus. And most of the parties who did protect nominations, being the Liberals and the Conservatives, would put certain stipulations around it, like they needed to have certain fundraising numbers and they needed to have certain membership levels and so on within their riding associations, although the Liberals then went and eliminated paid memberships for their entire organization regardless, so that kind of became moot. However, they did have these metrics in terms of what an MP needed to have in their riding before their nomination would be protected from a challenge in an open nomination. And this is nevertheless problematic because one of the features of an open nomination is the fact that you can unseat an incumbent as a way of holding them to account. And there are examples where people have felt that their incumbent MP is not doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, or they're not living up to it, or there's been allegations of scandal and so on, and have been able to organize challenges to unseat the incumbent so someone else can run for the party on that ballot. And that's grassroots democracy in action. That's something that's really important, and it's something that we really should be protecting, because democracy is supposed to be grassroots and local, and it's supposed to be the ability of the local community to have a say in who is representing them and holding that person to account, and all of these sorts of things that the practice of democracy is invigorated by. And, democracy is not just, voting once every 4 years and, kind of washing your hands of it from, at that point. The whole point of grassroots democracy is that you are involved in the party. You have ownership over the party because you are making local decisions. You are debating policy. You have a conduit between the local riding association and the caucus in Ottawa. These are all really important parts of democracy as an everyday exercise that Canadians should be exercising, but we've really gotten away from. The more that parties centralize power in their leaders' offices, the Liberals in their 2016 constitution change pretty much wiped out the grassroots as an organizational structure in order to have a very top-down, leadership-driven movement, because they didn't want to just be a party anymore. And that has real deleterious effects on the ability to have grassroots organizations and for the ordinary people in that grassroots to have ownership of that party. Instead, it becomes the analogy I like to use is a hermit crab. It's an empty shell with a party brand on it that every leader moves in and moves out of like a hermit crab, and it's not really good for democracy, even if the trappings of democracy are there in terms of a leadership vote and then a general election. But the everyday grassroots exercise of finding candidates, debating policy, accountability at the grassroots level, that's all being lost. And that's an important consideration that we need to be having, and not just shrugging off and saying, oh, it's always been us. The leader should have some measure of control over who's in the caucus, because that's institutionalizing this structure where where the party is essentially a personality cult of the leader, and parties should not be that, and that's not how democracy should be running. Yes, there are concerns when it comes to open nominations or things being a little too free, because there have been examples in history where, for example, anti-abortion groups would try and swamp nomination meetings in order to get their own candidates on the ballot. And there should be safety valves around that, but it should be something particularly grassroots, such as a council of riding presidents or so on, who can declare that a nomination's been invalidated or so on, as opposed to just being the leader. Because there are problems when the leader has that much authority, and we've seen that happen. There's a whole chapter or section in my book about this, which was when they changed the Canada Elections Act to put name and party on the ballot, because it used to be name, address, and occupation, and that created all kinds of problems. But essentially, they wanted to ensure that Elections Canada would stay out, and that they wanted to ensure there'd be no spoofing on the ballots. So their safeguard mechanism was to have the leader sign off on nomination papers, so that it would say, yes, that is the candidate for our party, and can have their party name on the ballot. The problem was, and nobody even thought of this at the time, was it created a way for leaders to blackmail members of their caucus that if they don't stay in line, they're not going to get their nomination paper signed. And that's been a problem in Canadian politics ever since. So it's one of those things with unintended consequences that we need to find a new workaround for, and so on. So again, yes, it's important to have a safety valve for race nominations where parties where they can be hijacked to the local level, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the leader, because that invites more problems. The other thing that kept coming up in this conversation we were having over Bluesky about this was that leaders need to be able to appoint to in order to meet diversity targets, which is again untrue. And again, in recent history, the Liberals in particular had a program about trying to get more women nominated, and they used actual research that shows that women need to be asked 6 or 7 times before they will actually consent to running. Men will often, at the first, when being asked to run, will say yes immediately. Women need to be convinced. And so they had this whole program about getting more women involved by ensuring that you're asking them enough times, that you're convincing them, that you're giving them supports, that you're ensuring that they have the essentially the reassurance that they are the person for the job and that they can do it. And they were wildly successful at this, and the number of women who were nominated in open nominations skyrocketed. And it requires effort. The NDP, as part of their policies, ensure that for their open nominations, at least one of the candidates must be of an equity-seeking group, which could mean women, could be LGBT, could mean racialized, could be Indigenous. But so it's not just 2 straight white men going contesting the nomination, that you've got someone who is not a straight white man also contesting that nomination. Now, again, the NDP sometimes like to fudge around that. But again, that's their structural way of trying to ensure that they have enough minorities and women on the ballot. Part of the problem there, however, tends to be that so many of those people on the ballots tend to be in unwinnable ridings for that party. So yes, they have the most candidates who are women and who are racialized or marginal communities or so on, but they're not necessarily in winnable ridings. That's the other thing, is that again, a leader nominating people could put them in winnable ridings, but just as often don't. So it's again double-edged sword, but it also is just as an excuse for why you need the leader to have appointment powers instead of having nominations. It's more of a lazy excuse. You can have people who are of diverse backgrounds in open nominations, but it just requires effort, and that often requires the people in that riding, in the grassroots organization, caring about having more diverse voices within the party, and that's perfectly valid, and it's I think a better exercise of democracy than just having the leader drop candidates in ridings. Particularly because, as we have seen with the current Prime Minister, some of the people with whom he drops in those ridings are close friends of his and are a little too chummy, and it gets a little cozy. when the leader has a lot of very close people to him or her running in safe seats because they were put in that riding and not because it was an open nomination where the people in that riding chose the friend of that leader to run. So again, these are all really important considerations when it comes to why open nominations are important. There was one last aspect of this conversation that we had, which was about primaries in the US. And primaries are different from an open nomination in Canada because in the US, when you register for a party, they run statewide, essentially nomination races. But they're on a much larger scale, and that creates distortionary effects where you have the effect of people running to the extremes during the primaries and then trying to run in the center in the general election. And that's kind of how the Tea Party took over the Republicans, followed by MAGA, is because of this tendency because you need to appeal to such a wide swath of people on a statewide primary that you start, running more and more extreme campaigns. And then saying that, oh, we'll run to the center in the general, and then it doesn't necessarily happen that way. With a Canadian open nomination, it is just the membership of the Grassroots Riding Association, the size of which can depend on how active that riding association is. It can be a couple hundred people, it can be a couple thousand people, it just kind of depending. But there's a difference in how those are run. One last thing to say about this was that at the Conservative Convention over this past weekend, they did make some changes in the party rules about these contests in order to ensure that they are more fair, and removed the ability of the party to put their thumb on the scales for candidates that the leader and his or her chief of staff would like to see running in those ridings, because they had a number of ridings in the election last time where the people who had been organizing and collecting signatures and selling memberships and so on in order for that nomination contest were essentially blindsided and either had the rules kind of jerked around on them at the last minute, or just kind of had someone essentially dropped in by the party using dubious mechanisms to do so, essentially negating all the work that they'd done trying to put their name forward for that nomination. And it left a sour taste in a lot of people. Some of them got so turned off that they decided to campaign for the Liberals instead. And it happened in more than one riding too. So these are real considerations about how and why grassroots democracy is important, and why it's important that parties don't manipulate these processes to favor the leader, because then you start winding up with even more undemocratic results. And these are all things that we should be thinking about as to why open nominations are important. Mark Carney has decided he's not running open nominations in these upcoming by-elections. I think that's a mistake for all of these reasons I've outlined. And I'm hoping that, as a country, we can start reminding the parties that the grassroots is important, that these voices should be heard, particularly the Liberals, because they have essentially wiped out their grassroots organization and they need to rebuild that. Because democracy is important, and democracy should be a grassroots everyday exercise and not a vote once every 4 years and turn it into a spectator sport. That weakens democracy, and that sets us up for potential problems in the future, as we are seeing south of the border right now. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.